All right. Okay. So this is Harold Cruse, The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual, and the soundtrack is Shabaka and the Ancestors, Wisdom of the Elders. This is the chapter, The Intellectuals and Force and Violence. The American social system is unlike any other in world history. America is a nation that has been pragmatically created, a nation that has emerged from the old into something new and original, never seen before. The inner dynamics of American social change were, from the very onset, self-contained. Thus, in relation to foreign ideologies the world over, America is almost a closed system. It grows, develops, and even reacts to outside social currents, according to the persuasions of its own self-contained inner dynamic. Not only has America absorbed wave after wave of immigrants, she also absorbs all the radical ideologies of immigrants and Americanizes them by negation. Considering what has happened to revolutionary Marxism, introduced into America by German immigrants back in the 1840s, Roosevelt's New Deal of the 1930s unveiled the communist revolutionaries into a united front, emasculated them, stole their programs, and patronized them with semi-official recognition. But after brain-picking and tolerating these radicals in order to neutralize them, the federal power then turned on them with a vengeance, cast them out into the cold, and then prosecuted them for the sin of political prostitution. All of this would seem to suggest that the American social system is immune to the trials of social revolution. But this is far from true. As any modern economist knows, for social revolution as such does not necessarily correspond to any preconceived formulas extracted from some foreign revolution of decades past. Each new social revolution is unique. There have been a variety of social revolutions, but there will be still others. The modern world emerged painfully out of a series of such revolutions, all of them rather protracted, and all of them characterized by much force and violence. The United States emerged as an independent nation through the force and violence of an American Revolution. And even before 1775, this revolution was being prepared by the force and violence the British, French, and Indians inflicted on each other. Afterwards, the American nation grew and expanded through many decades of forceful and violent conquest. The entire 19th century history of the United States is a violent one. Indian wars, slave uprisings, civil war, more Indian wars, race violence, and labor violence. After the forcible pacification of the Indians, both labor and racial violence continued into the 20th century. The traditionally violent nature of American society has its roots in several factors: its expansive frontier ideology, its racial composition, and its labor-capital relationships. Writing about American labor of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Theodore Draper says the relations between labor and capital were largely undefined and uncontrollable except by sheer force on both sides. Employers fought labor organization by every possible means. Strikes were ruthlessly crushed by armed guards, police, sheriffs, militia, and federal troops, end quote. The violence that attended early American labor relations was due much more to the indigenous qualities of America than to the importation of the foreign revolutionary doctrine of anarchism. In fact, the use of force and violence did not become a controversial issue even for the professional revolutionaries themselves until the period around 1906, when three labor leaders, one of whom was William D. Haywood, Big Bill, of the IWW, were arrested for complicity in the bombing murder of the governor of Idaho. Of this arrest and the labor unrest leading up to it, Draper says, quote, they were finally released, but the entire labor movement had come to their defense since the overshadowing issue, they were finally released, but the entire labor movement had come to their defense since the overshadowing issue of the case was the responsibility of the labor movement for the violence which had characterized the great American strikes for 2 decades, end quote. From this point on until 1912, the question of force and violence so agitated all revolutionary and reform socialists that the Socialist Party of America was forced to resolve the matter. Quote, long a matter of dispute as a theoretical issue, writes Draper, force and violence now had to be settled as a matter of practical politics. During the Socialist Party's convention in the spring of 1912, quote, Article 2, Section 6 of the party's constitution was changed to expel anyone, quote, who opposes political action or advocates crime, sabotage, or other methods of violence as a weapon of the working class, end quote. This amendment was upheld by a referendum vote of 13,000 to 4,000. Haywood was expelled from the Socialist Party's National Executive Committee for holding to the view that the capitalist system should be overthrown, quote, by forcible means if necessary, end quote. From 1912 to 1913, about 15% of the membership left the Socialist Party along with Haywood, whose real home was the IWW, the most extreme revolutionary faction of the labor movement. Many of those who sympathized with Haywood's position on force and violence belonged to the developing radical left wing which formed the nucleus of what later became the American Communist Party in 1919. But it was not long before the newly formed communists themselves began to play down all overt references to the use of force and violence in their political activities. So, for about 40 years, the question of revolutionary force and violence became mostly an academic issue in American radical politics. The indictment of the Communist Party of America in 1948 was not for overt acts of force and violence, but, among other things, for conspiring and organizing to, quote, teach and advocate the overthrow and destruction of the government of the United States by force and violence, end quote. That's found in the History of the Communist Party USA, page 509. In 1952, William Z. Foster stated the official position of his party. Quote, the Communist Party, although it does not advocate violence in the workers' struggles, cannot, however, declare that there will be no violence in the establishment of socialism in this country, end quote. In the struggle for socialism, the communists believe that quote, a peaceful path of development is quite possible for certain capitalist countries, end quote, according to Foster. This was Joseph Stalin's view as far back as 1928. Today, the Trotskyist Socialist Workers' Party considers itself the only true revolutionary Marxist party, at least in theory. Actually, funnily, that's very true. I knew a Trotskyist. I lived with him, which hews strictly to the line of class struggle politics. It was very class struggle, yeah. However, a closer examination will reveal that Trotskyists differ from communists only in the matter of form. Their theoretical positions differ only in an academic degree, inasmuch as both Marxist factions suffer the same limitations imposed on them by the peculiarities of American capitalism, which has, for all intents and purposes, negated class struggle on the part of the workers against the capitalists. The same can be said for all radical factions in American society today who claim allegiance to the Marxist tradition. Let me say that again. Today, the Trotskyist Socialist Workers' Party considers itself the only true revolutionary party, at least in theory, which hews strictly to the line of class struggle politics. However, a close examination will reveal that Trotskyists differ from the communists only in the matter of form. Their theoretical positions differ only in an academic degree, inasmuch as both Marxist factions suffer the same limitations imposed on them by the peculiarities of American capitalism, which has, for all intents and purposes, negated class struggle on the part of the workers against the capitalists. The same could be said for all radical factions in American society today who claim allegiance to the Marxist tradition. Force and violence has become a principal question within the Negro movement proper, as distinct from Negro groups allied with other white-oriented trends. Like the early pre-communist white labor movements, the American Negro movement has experienced a long series of violent eras on the racial front, going all the way back to the slave rebellions of Nat Turner and Denmark Vesey. And that's early 1800s. But it's been even before that. Think of Zombie in Palmeiras, 1604 to 1695. These historical episodes of force and violence in Negro history have been hallowed as prototypical examples of the revolutionary potential in the Negro presence in America. Everyone from, and again, Negro presence in America, Palmeiras is Brazil, Bahia. Think about the Colombos there. Colombos means war camp. They got those from the Jaga, the Evombo people, according to scholar Michael Gomez. Although Turner and Vesey never heard of Marx and Engels, and would not have known either one from a slave master, there are certain communist historians who try to see a direct line from the slave revolts in Virginia to the projected socialist revolution, wherein Negroes in the 20th century will storm the capitalist stronghold. On the other hand, certain black nationalists of today see in the same revolts the beginning of the black nationalist movement. But more rebellions are not revolutions in themselves, especially in America. So far in America, rebellions, both black and white, have been piecemeal and sporadic social reactions in response to or in reaction against the American capitalist revolution as it progresses. The African, by being enslaved, was drawn into the exchange machinery of the capitalistic industrial revolution as a human commodity. His revolt, her revolt, their revolt under slavery was simply a revolt against being brutally enslaved, inasmuch as all slaves in all historical eras have been known to revolt. When seen in historical perspective, all American rebellions and uprisings have come in waves under changing capitalistic conditions and have different objectives from previous waves. Although the Negro in the South of today is still seeking the freedom that the ex-slave expected, the modern rebellion is taking place under different capitalistic conditions and is in great degree a profound response to those very conditions. Add to these regional conditions in the South proper the penetrating influences of the larger world-embracing political conditions, and you have what some have called the revolution of rising expectations. Yet, the Negro movement is not yet a revolutionary movement, no matter what the radical idealists say about it. This movement cannot become revolutionary until it articulates objectives which transcend its present aims, racial integration. The very fact that many radicals and revolutionaries attempt to connect the present-day Negro rebellion with the slave rebellion only serves to reveal its limitations. At least the slaves knew exactly what they wanted, the abolition of the slave system. Today, every Negro in or out of the freedom movement knows he wants, quote, freedom, but actually not one knows what he really wants out of present-day America. Therefore, to hark romantically back to the slave rebellions for the purpose of bolstering present-day revolutionary morale is rather pointless. Moreover, it only shows just how far the modern Negro in America has retrogressed in revolutionary virtue when his leadership can talk him into accepting nonviolence as a means of achieving his aims. Today, the Negro movement's most radical wing, which calls itself a nonviolent committee, has recently worked hand in hand with another segment that upholds the virtues of passive resistance. For 50-odd years, the NAACP has nurtured a race of people on policies of constitutionalism and legal redress. But during the late 1950s, in the Civil Rights episode in Monroe, North Carolina, these legalistic traditions served to reintroduce the old historical problem of force and violence in a curious and interesting way. For a more detailed account of the Monroe, North Carolina case, see People with Strength, The Story of Monroe, North Carolina. Also, Robert F. Williams' Negro with Guns. Robert F. Williams had taken over a defunct NAACP branch in Monroe, reorganized it, and put the branch on a functioning basis with a program of desegregating certain public facilities. Williams' actions brought on the bitter resistance of the Ku Klux Klan, who resorted to traditional terror tactics in an attempt to frighten Williams into submission. But Williams, an ex-Marine, retaliated by organizing his followers into a rifle club and drilling them into an effective armed corps against the attacks of the Klan. Without going into all the details of the Monroe affair, it is enough to say that the town became an armed camp of high tensions between black and white. There was a long reign of terror, jailings, and beatings. In the course of these happenings, Williams was moved to make a public statement to the effect that Negroes might have to stop lynching with lynching. This marked the first time that a local NAACP branch leader in the South had openly espoused meeting violence with violence, and it brought Williams into a policy conflict with the NAACP. The organization censured Williams for expressing views contrary to association policy, which could, quote, be used by segregationists to spread the false impression that the NAACP supported lynching and violence. 1 month after his statement, Williams was suspended from the NAACP for 6 months by the board of directors. Later, Williams publicly altered his original statement to mean that, quote, Negroes should have the right of armed self-defense against attack, end quote. From 1959, May 8th, June 9th, July 18th. Whichever way, Robert Williams meant to use violence, that is, offensively or defensively. His armed self-defense tactic became the ideological spark that ignited a hidden potential within the newly emerging phase of the Negro movement. But this potential did not really begin to show itself until about 5 years later. Other ingredients had to be added. In analyzing the Williams-Monroe affair, it is interesting to note that Williams' conflict with the NAACP's official policy in 1959 resembles somewhat the old Socialist Party's conflict with the left-wing labor radicals over force and violence back in 1912. There was a resemblance, but there was also an important difference. The old IWW leader, William Haywood, actually espoused offensive, direct action with the aim of overthrowing the capitalist system, quote, by forcible means if necessary, end quote. Williams did not and could not espouse offensive, direct action by any means possible for any tangible objective. He merely espoused self-defense, a retaliatory action. A note, I think I'm sorry. This approach grew out of the objective nature of race relations because Williams was not contemplating overthrowing anything, but much less the capitalist system. Repeating that. In analyzing the Williams-Monroe affair, it is interesting to note that Williams' conflict with the NAACP's official policy in 1959 resembles somewhat the old Socialist Party's conflict with the left-wing labor radicals over force and violence back in 1912. There was a resemblance, but there was also an important difference. The old IWW leader, William Haywood, actually espoused offensive direct action with the aim of overthrowing the capitalist system, quote, by forcible means if necessary. Williams did not and could not espouse offensive direct action by any means possible for any tangible objective. He merely espoused self-defense, a retaliatory action. This approach grew out of the objective nature of race relations because Williams was not contemplating overthrowing anything, much less the capitalist system. The Negro movement is fundamentally a protest movement, not a revolutionary movement. Furthermore, the adoption of armed self-defense does not in itself transform what was a protest movement into a revolutionary movement. This is true despite the fact that many of Williams' most ardent supporters in the North consider his adoption of self-defense a revolutionary accomplishment. If Williams had at the same time changed his social objective, he might have fulfilled this definition. His objective remained exactly what it was before, desegregation. And desegregation of public facilities was also the aim of the official NAACP leadership. Thus, Williams differed not in aims, but in tactics from the NAACP when he opted for armed self-defense. But this raised an important question for the entire Negro movement, one that has not yet been answered. Could armed self-defense really lead to desegregation? The northern-based revolutionaries who supported Williams were so eager to see Monroe, North Carolina as the takeoff location for a new revolutionary wave that they forgot that Monroe was merely one isolated spot on the civil rights map. Because Williams defied the conservative, legalistic, and nonviolent traditions of the NAACP. His supporters began to act as if armed self-defense was the latest thing in revolutionary effectiveness and also the final answer to all tactical questions for the future. Few asked themselves why it was necessary for the issue to be raised so as to suggest that the right to self-defense was a privilege that Negroes could not assume without asking the question. Few asked themselves why it was necessary for the issue to be raised so as to suggest that the right to self-defense was a privilege that Negroes could not assume without asking the sanction of the NAACP, the public authorities, and the president, or without publicizing beforehand that self-defense is a God-given right of every living man. Once more, it was demonstrated how deeply ingrained is the protest tradition in Negro thinking. Even Williams' plea for the right of self-defense was in itself another form of protest. It is difficult to believe that Williams had any illusion that he was going to change the policies of the NAACP, but he acted as if he did. Otherwise, he would have seen clearly that the NAACP was an inhospitable place for himself and his views. He might have realized that what he had in mind had much broader implications than the immediate situation in Monroe, a small community that could not stand alone. He might have seen that his aims required a larger scope of organization, broader planning, and a longer-range strategical vision. The Monroe episode actually raised important questions. How does armed self-defense relate to the civil rights movement as a whole? How would armed self-defense apply in the North, South, East, or West? How would armed self-defense relate to the nonviolent or the passive resistance forces? How does armed self-defense apply in certain northern locations where desegregation of swimming pools or public libraries, as in Monroe, is not a force and violence issue? Or how would armed self-defense relate to northern cities where police brutality is a force and violence issue, because it is a form of violence inflicted by an arm of the state against Negroes in particular? Lastly, but not least, how does armed self-defense relate to the various blends of black nationalism flourishing today? However, as long as the Negro movement, in all its various tendencies and segments, remains essentially a protest movement seeking civil rights, its objectives will remain more moral and ethical than tangible. One can objectively shoot a Klansman defensively or offensively, but to succeed in shooting one's way into voting rights, jobs, and, quote, desegregated public facilities calls for much deeper thought than certain revolutionaries seem to imagine. The issue of armed self-defense as projected by Williams in 1959 presides the emergence of other factors deeply hidden within the Negro movement. It was not until after 1959 that these factors began to reveal themselves. Part of this fateful evolution was the rise of what John Henry Clark of Freedom Waves called the New Afro-American Nationalism. As distinct from the more publicized Nation of Islam movement, this new nationalism was represented in the ideas of a new young generation born in the late 1930s and early 1940s. This generation grew up in a time to be deeply impressed by the emergence of the African states, the Cuban Revolution, Malcolm X, and Robert Williams himself. They were witnessing a revolutionary age of the liberation of oppressed people. Thus, they were led to connect their American situation with those foreign revolutionary situations. They did not know, of course, that to attempt to apply foreign ideologies to the United States was more easily imagined than accomplished. They did not know that the revolutionary Marxists had attempted this and had come to grief. In fact, they did not even know what a Marxist was, even though they were destined to have to contend with them in their own little movements. They did not realize how little they actually understood about what they saw happening, nor did they have the slightest idea of how much they had to learn about the past 40-odd years before they could even begin to understand the revolutionary age in which they lived. They also were unaware that many of the older generation did not understand them, or what they implied as a new, young generation. They also were unaware that many of the older generation did not understand them, or what they implied as a new, young generation. Before long, they would even be misinterpreted on Freedom Waves magazine by John Henry Clark, who would describe the new Afro-American nationalism as proletarian, when in fact it was crowded with young intellectuals, artists, writers, poets, and musicians. These young people were actually coming of age into a great intellectual, political, creative, and theoretical vacuum. They would enter the arena of activity in search of leadership and find little but confusion, since leaders were few and destined to be evanescent. But despite all this, they would learn. One of the most outstanding of them, Leroi Jones, learned in such a personal way as to epitomize within himself all the other things his generation learned either empirically or vicariously. Several years before anyone had heard of Robert Williams or Monroe, Leroi Jones had moved into Greenwich Village from his hometown of Newark in New Jersey. This was during the middle 1950s. At the time, Jones appeared very quiet, unassuming, reticent, even meek, although curious about everything. But thinking back, one wonders if perhaps his inner personality had not been grossly misinterpreted. I, for example, met Jones from time to time, here and there, without expending too much attention on him. A person in my background would have been incomprehensible to Jones anyway. And as for Jones, he was then just another addition to the black intellectual scene of Greenwich Village, and rather late at that. From that point on, Jones made the beat generation scene. His name became linked with that of Jack Kerouac, and he soon began to make his name as a beat poet of talent. But at the same time, there were others of Jones's generation emerging in Harlem, the natives of the black ghetto. Later, Jones would meet up with these, but not before he went, through more conditioning. But his conditioning was to be for certain social objectives that others of his generation could not clearly see. They were acting intuitively, and the outlines of the future were vague and undefinable. As this generation had the impossible inheritance of 3 decades of conflicting ideologies, not their own. But the late 1950s and the present 1960s became what can be called the new era of black ideological transformation, especially amongst the newest wave of intellectuals. The great transformation in Leroi Jones was brought on by the Cuban Revolution. In July 1960, I accompanied Jones to Cuba to see for ourselves what it was all about. It was the first time since Jones came to the village scene that I had had the opportunity to observe him intimately, and he had by then become rather contemptuous of individuals not of his generation. In his article about his trip Cuba Libre, he wrote mockingly of certain individuals in the writer's contingent as being 1940-ish and 1930-ish, as if to say that the really in thing was to be 1950-ish. Jones was also disappointed by the fact that many of the name writers he was eager to meet did not accept the invitation to Cuba with him. At that time, though Jones considered himself a beat and a nonconformist, he was still very impressed with name writers. The only people on this contingent to Cuba who had any kind of reputation for being engagé, either literarily and or politically, were Robert Williams, Julian Mayfield, John Henry Clark, and myself. At any rate, his actual experiences in Cuba amply compensated Jones for the lack of representative Negro writers in his delegation. In Havana, it was noted that Jones made a very favorable impression on the revolutionary intelligentsia of the Castro regime. Although they were all white Cubans, it was remarkable to see how much they and Jones had in common. They actually talked the same language. As I was 1940-ish, I noticeably held back all outward exuberance for the Cuban situation. I was admittedly pro-Castro, but there were too many communists around acting imperious and important. Moreover, there was the obvious and unclarified position of the Cuban Negro to consider. Yet, we were all treated with such overwhelming deference, consideration, and privilege. It was difficult to be critical. The crowning event of this trip was the long journey from Havana to Sierra Maestre. Riding with us in a string of modern air-conditioned coaches was a large corps from the international press of Europe, Latin America, United States, and the Far East. In this instance, the ideology of a new revolutionary wave in the world at large had lifted us out of the anonymity of lonely struggle in the United States to the glorified rank of visiting dignitaries. For Jones's impressionable generation, this revolutionary indoctrination, this ideological enchantment was almost irresistible. And here, vicariously, a crucial question was engendered. What did it all mean, and how did it relate to the Negro in America? It did demonstrate incontrovertibly the relevance of force and violence to successful revolutions, especially abroad. Beyond that, neither Robert Williams, who tried mightily, nor Jones's generation have adequately explained it in Afro-American terms. But we hardly thought about that in the morning of July 26, 1960, at the foot of the Sierra Maestre Mountains. We were caught up in a revolutionary outpouring of thousands upon thousands of people making their way up in the mountain roads to the shrine of the revolution, under the hottest sun-drenching any of us Americans had probably ever experienced. Jones and I stood shoulder to shoulder in a Cuban rebel army truck packed to its side with liberated Castroites, whose euphoria we could feel profoundly, but not experience. Nothing in our American experience had ever been as arduous and exhausting as this journey. Our reward was the prize of revolutionary protocol that favored those victims of capitalism away from home. We were escorted by a guard of armed rebels to the official platform and presented to Fidel Castro. There we were seated in the company of the rebel elite as Castro turned up and spoke for 4 hours to the Sierra Maestre Hills, covered with people as far as the eye could see. Robert Williams was the nominal leader of our contingent, but Jones was the most interesting personality. During the whole time, I watched him closely and wondered what he was thinking. I wondered how this Green Village beat poet would relate politically, artistically, ideologically to this foreign revolution. These questions were soon to be answered back in the United States, beginning with certain events of 1961 when Jones ventured from the village to the Harlem scene. In the meantime, however, Jones had formed personal associations with the John O. Killings literary faction through Julian Mayfield and John Henry Clark via Havana. It probably did not occur to Jones either there or back in New York that he could never thrive literarily or ideologically with this left-wing faction. Artistically, they and Jones were poles apart. What held them together in a temporary and functional alliance was their attachment to Robert Williams and his Monroe Affair, and the Cuban Revolution. But not a single one of them succeeded in analyzing the implications of their new alliance, just as none of them were seriously analyzing the meaning of Williams' armed self-defense tactic. What did Negro creative intellectuals have to do with Williams and armed self-defense? Was the Negro writer's role simply to support Robert Williams verbally or organizationally? If so, this was no more than was expected from everybody else. Since for the most part, all Negro writers functioned out of New York, what did the situation there, Harlem that is, have to do with Monroe, North Carolina, where desegregation, despite armed self-defense, was simply trying to catch up with northern desegregation won by law? Whose movement was more important overall, Monroe's or Harlem's? Or did they complement each other? Since no one seriously attempted to explore these matters, it was not at all surprising that Robert Williams and a couple of intellectual supporters got badly boxed up in their communications between Harlem and Monroe. As a result, they were forced to exile, leaving behind them one Harlem woman who became the hostage for the authorities. There were several factors involved in the Monroe, North Carolina fiasco. In the first place, all kinds of factions descended on Williams and his self-defense cohorts. There were left-wing Trotskyists, freedom riders, and representatives of other civil rights groups, all pro-integrationist forces. On the other hand, there were also nationalist-oriented individuals from Harlem, not to speak of certain writers with muddled views on integrationism and nationalism. They all saw something in Monroe that did not actually exist, an immediate revolutionary situation. But the Monroe defeat highlighted certain northern dilemmas among them, the question of the new Afro-American nationalism. In the North, the bulk of Williams supporters from the young generation were nationalists. Neither Clark nor Mayfield, however, belonged to this group, and even Jones had not fully arrived. Robert Williams himself was never a nationalist, but an avowed integrationist, a fact that later created much propaganda confusion. For the young nationalists celebrated Williams as their leader, since his self-defense stand coincided with their rising interests in the adoption of force and violence tactics in the North. But in the North, armed self-defense would not be against an unofficial force such as the Klan, but would arise in opposition to the police, the Army, and the National Guard, official arms of the state power. It should be noted in passing that Williams would have welcomed the intervention of the Federal National Guard in Monroe, but that same intervention was not welcomed in Watts, LA, for obvious reasons. Watts was not Monroe, and the force and violence occurring there was on a far different level. Although force and violence could be a revolutionary ingredient, self-defense, as Williams projected it, is not revolutionary, even with arms. It is exactly what it says it is, defensive, at best, a holding action. Misconceptions about this have led to other fiascos and failures. For example, in Harlem, uprisings are ignited spontaneously over one issue, such as police brutality, but are actually deep-rooted in the general social conditions. Yet, the slogan of armed self-defense was militantly raised so as to provoke the police into more severe repressive actions. Yet the slogan of the armed self-defense was militantly raised so as to provoke the police into more severe repressive actions by giving them a ready-made excuse to shoot to kill. Needless to say, not a single one of the basic economic, political, or cultural aspects of the Harlem social conditions that feed the riotous proclivities of the population are ever touched on by the revolutionaries who misapply the slogan of armed self-defense. The failures of the intellectuals is what they do not attempt to clarify these issues. Needless to say, not a single one of the basic economic, political, or cultural aspects of the Harlem social condition that feed the riotous proclivities of the population are ever touched on by the revolutionaries, who misapply the slogan of armed self-defense. The failure of the intellectuals is that they do not attempt to clarify these issues. Another reason why the tactic of armed self-defense in the North is so inappropriate is that historically, black nationalism has never upheld the use of force and violence. This is another compelling reason why Garveyism, to which many of the young nationalists hark back, is today passé. Garveyism was not a revolutionary, but a reformist. Garvey's scheme for a, quote, peaceful return to Africa creates both practical and theoretical problems for today's new Afro-American nationalists who study Garveyism historically, but are less and less inclined to peaceful methods. But the emergence of free African states with political autonomy has done Garveyism's work for him. Even so, most of the West Indians from Garvey's homeland in Jamaica leave home not to return to Africa, but to emigrate to the British Isles. This is the fact that the Garveyites do not like to discuss, but that must force the new young nationalists to realize that ultimately, their situation must have an American, not an African solution. This means that Afro-American nationalism must be geared organically into the Native American revolutionary dynamic towards social change. Today, Afro-American nationalism is the main force behind that social dynamic, and as such, the last social link to the unsolved American nationality dilemma. Well, now with FBA and Adolf, things have changed, but not also, right? However, this social dynamic comprises many factors: practical, organizational, institutional, and theoretical, and each one is essential to the whole. Force and violence enters the picture only to the degree that American white institutions resist the pressure to stress. Why is my mouth not working? However, this social dynamic comprises many factors: practical, organizational, institutional, and theoretical, and each one is essential to the whole. Force and violence enters the picture only to the degree that American white institutions resist the pressures towards social change exerted by the Afro-American social dynamic. Social resistance there has been and will be, yet, ironically, much of this resistance, though less overt and demonstrative than methods of force and violence, is just as effective. But in terms of the peculiarities of the... Hold up. Pause. I have to get some water.